Mr. Plaut, thank you for giving us this opportunity today to have this interview. What we want is, because you've been involved in Eritrean history, you've been to Eritrea a few times, and you wrote a lot of books about Eritrea, and you still keep writing. I'm very amazed where do you get this energy to keep writing about Eritrea. So if you can help us, tell us about how you keep writing this is the main thing, and if you can start how you get interested to Eritrea and the Eritrean people.
I became interested in Eritrea in the late 1970s when I was working for the British Labour Party, and a young Eritrean by the name of Ermias walked into the office. He was the European representative of the EPLF, and he said to me, "You must come to my country." And I said, "But isn't there a war?" He said, "Yeah, but if you come, we'll look after you." So I went to Port Sudan, they picked me up. I drove for 36 hours into the field, through Suakin and then up into the field, and I came to see what the EPLF were doing to fight for the independence of Eritrea, and ever since then I've been absolutely fascinated by Eritrea. Of course, I'm not an Eritrean, but I am an African, and so I'm involved and concerned and interested in the country.
So when first time you went to Eritrea, what did you see? Where did you go?
Well, the first thing that we arrived at, which was very surprising, was that there was a stick across the road, or a pole across the road, and even though it wasn't a country, a young member of the EPLF took our name, and he insisted on, recording that we'd arrived. And from there we went to the information department, where people were printing books and pamphlets and leaflets and news about Eritrea, which they were distributing inside but also outside the country. And then we went up to the front. We went to Nakfa. We saw Nakfa, which was still being held. It'd been badly bombed, but it was still being held. And I think we ate the last chicken in Nakfa, which I felt very bad about, because people were very hungry and we were eating their chicken. So I felt bad about that. But to the hospital, and the hospital was a very long hospital, because it had to only be safe from the bombing, because the Ethiopians controlled the skies. And we saw the hospital, and they were doing amazing surgery in there, including bone surgery, taking bones from the hip of a man and repairing the jaw of a man who'd shot it away with a bullet. It was extraordinary, really, really good. They did a fantastic job. So that was really impressive. We saw some of the prisoners. And so that was the first time I went. I went again in the mid-1980s. I went for the BBC, which I was then working for, and I reported from the BBC. And I was actually in the trenches above Keren, looking down on Keren. I could see the Ethiopians firing artillery up at us. We were in a deep trench, and I could see the Ethiopians walking around, the soldiers, and with their guns and the tanks and everything in Keren. And then after 91, and the liberation of Asmara, I went to Asmara, and I stayed with a friend who was living there, and I got to know more of people there, and it was a fascinating time, absolutely fascinating.
But if you can go back to when you went first time before the freedom, you met Eritrean fighters. Do you have any memory that sits in your heart or in your mind for any disabled or veteran or elderly people, kids?
I remember two things very, very strikingly. The first was the attention to information. So, for example, even though there was a war, they were all encouraged to listen, ordinary people were encouraged to listen to even Ethiopian radio, the BBC, as well as Eritrean radio. And then they would discuss issues. So it was an extraordinary ability to be open to other people's ideas, which I thought was amazing. The second thing, which was terribly moving, was that I met some Eritrean fighters, but also the disabled people, many of whom had lost an arm or a leg. And when they were greeted by their brothers, by the fighters, and they were, meeting each other with their shoulders in the traditional way, then the fighters would actually hold the disabled fighters and put them to their so they didn't fall over, because these men were on crutches, men and women, of course. They were doing, and it was such a tender and warm moment. It really moved me, and I was deeply moved about the way in which the fighters looked after the disabled, and they didn't just throw them away as junk anymore. They really saw them as heroes, and that they were really part of the community. They weren't prepared to get rid of them. And I thought that was amazing.
Okay, interesting. So after that, 1991, you went back to Eritrea, and you met a lot of Eritrean people, ordinary people, and from the fighting group as well. So how do you describe that?
It was an extraordinary moment. I mean, 91 was just magical, because there was this tremendous feeling of optimism, of hope, that Eritrea was going to now have the country that it deserved, a democratic country in which people really could work for the good of the country and for the good of themselves. It was one of the things that was really clear, was that people had fought for their country for 30 years. Some of them for 30 years, some of course less, but I mean the country had fought for 30 years. And now it was their opportunity to also look after their family for the first time. Many of them hadn't seen their families for years and years and years. And so there was a great joy and a feeling of unity and pride and optimism. And of course I thought that Eritrea was going to be a wonderful country that everybody could be proud of. And it was wonderful, absolutely marvellous.
Okay, interesting. So back to 1994, I don't know if you remember, the disabled veteran was killed in Mahabar. So how did you feel when the first time you met them in Sahel, and you saw them, their brothers hanging and kissing them, but in 1994 they were killed by their brothers or sisters?
I really couldn't understand it.
Yeah.
I couldn't understand it. I found it, because don't forget, I was not there. I was here in London, I was working for the BBC, we got these reports. I just could not believe that this was done. And I couldn't believe that when they marched into Asmara, that the police would open fire on them. I mean, it was unthinkable, absolutely unthinkable. And I thought, there must be something else. There must be. I couldn't believe that it could be done. But then there was also, it wasn't only them, there was trouble with the women's organizations. You may remember that also then the soldiers went and they went round Asmara, firing in the air and saying, "We want to speak to Isaias." And Isaias came and spoke to them in the stadium, and he heard their grievances and promised, "No, we will look after your grievances. We will definitely, make things right." The only thing he did was to round up the leaders, and I think some of them were shot and the rest were put in jail.
Yeah.
And I mean, then I began to think, no, there's something strange here.
So this thing, did it start in 91, or they had this kind of killing or capturing people or making in prison? Does this come from the old days? Because I don't see this as kind of a new to the military group or how they fought, but it must be something that was ongoing history, which was repeated by...
I think that's right. And at the time, I thought it was just, something out of the blue, that it was... that there was no history to it. But later I realized that there had been a lot of suppression inside the EPLF, and the Manka issue and other issues. I mean, it had actually happened many times before, but people had been very quiet about it because they hadn't spoken about it for a simple reason, which was that they felt that the first priority was independence. If they got independence, things would be okay. And I think that they underestimated the way in which President Isaias was ruthless and determined to maintain power. And I think the thing that he really, really could not accept at the end of the day was that he would not be able to have the same absolute control over the whole of Eritrean society as he had once had over the fighting force. Because when you're in a war, you can issue orders at the end. But when he lived in society, in a free society, then of course you don't have that right. Even if you're the president, you're only, yes, of course people take you with respect. And I was always struck by how respectful Eritreans were of Isaias for many, many, many years. There's some people who still are today.
Yeah.
But you still don't have the right to run your country like an army. And I think that he just could not accept that was what he couldn't do. And that's one of the great tragedies. But it's not unique to Eritrea. There are many, many African examples of liberation movements that cannot make the transition after independence or after liberation to being an ordinary political party.
Okay. So Eritrean people, we have untold history then, if that's the case. Because no one knows all what happened back during the fighting time, and we lost a lot of brothers and sisters.
Of course.
So this history has been hidden now is almost 26 years. Like we saw in 1994, the veteran was killed as well. Eritrea has now more prison camps than university or hospitals. How do you see that, the current situation we have in Eritrea?
Well, of course, it's a huge tragedy. It is terrible that people who paid such a high price for their freedom have now so little to show for it. Yes, they have an independent country, and that's of course wonderful. But where is the constitution? Where is the parliament? Where are the opposition parties? Where are the free newspapers? They're nowhere. And there isn't even a system of justice. It's arbitrary justice that's basically ruled by Isaias's word, and whatever he wants he can do. And I don't think this is what was promised to the Eritrean people.
So what's your view on Eritrea as being called like North Africa, North Korea? But for me, North Korea is more capable to treat its own nation citizens. But Eritrea is one of the kind of state of prison. So isn't there a mismatch matching the two countries? Well, because Eritrea is the worst country in the world at this state.
I don't know whether it's the worst country in the world. There's a lot of competition for the bottom place. If you look at Equatorial Guinea, it's not a happy place either. There's some really, really terrible countries in the world. It is certainly right at the bottom, near the bottom, let's put it that way. And I think that's a great tragedy. Whether it is the same as North Korea, I don't know. I've never been to North Korea. It certainly doesn't sound like a pleasant place. I think people use it as a metaphor because people know North Korea. Most people don't know Eritrea. Okay. Most people don't even know where it is.
The crisis we have now, the refugee, as you can see, then it starts from Eritrea, and the human traffickers are the senior military member of the PFDJ. These are the people who's trying to, what they do in the business, and we have now refugee crisis in Calais. I don't know if you saw the news last week, there was a gunshot, and we have a refugee in Israel. They will be deporting to the other African country like Rwanda, Uganda. What would be your advice on these problems we've seen?
Well, I think that the only thing that Eritreans can do, and this is of course up to Eritreans, not up to me what they do, but the only thing that Eritreans can do is keep going. To overcome the splits and divisions of the past, to find a way forward which is united, and to use the great strengths that they have and the institutions which they all believe in. And the particular institutions which I think are important in this regard are the church and the mosque. And both of those are very powerful institutions which people believe in strongly. And I think that even if the political parties collapse, the religious ones will not. And so I think that they are something that can at least help people to hold their lives together, because I think that is really, really important. But at the end of the day, Eritreans paid a terrible price for their freedom. And they are now paying again a terrible price because they are not they don't have basic human rights. And why should a young Eritrean accept that any more than anyone else would? This is wrong. And of course they have the right to fight for it. And the only thing that you have is your determination. And it's up to Eritreans to find a way forward.
Yeah. You've been writing about Eritrea on your website, plus book, I know that, Understanding of Eritrea. So how many books have you wrote about Eritrea? And what makes you keep writing about Eritrea?
I think I have 2 books. I've got lots of articles, some academic articles, some just journalism, and a website. Well, I go on because I think that there's a lack of information about Eritrea which is easily accessible to people. Of course, Eritreans can read in Tigrinya, Arabic and other languages on websites, but you know, if you're, should we say, an interested person from outside of Eritrea, or you're a young Eritrean who doesn't speak these languages, then I try and provide a service and try and put out news, information that I think is accurate. Of course, I will make mistakes like any human being would, but I would never make it on purpose. Yeah. So that is all I can do. It's a small contribution, but that is what I want to do for the Eritrean struggle.
Yeah. Well, for Eritreans, this is one of the biggest contributions you're making, and I can't believe it. You keep going, doing this, how vision you have. And I start reading about your understanding of Eritrea, and I was amazed by that at the time. So keep this writing. Where that energy comes from?
Well, it comes from the fact that you know, there are some Eritreans that I've known for 30, 40 years, and some of them are now in jail. And I think that is a tragedy, and I'm not going to give up while they're in jail and without facing any proper trial. Mm-hmm. But also because, you know, I was involved in the anti-apartheid struggle. I am a South African by origin, and people I know in Britain gave 20 years of their lives to that struggle. I know some people who literally spent every moment that they were awake working on South Africa, and they were British. And for me, that is like an example.
Yeah, interesting. So we've seen for the last few years, we've seen a lot of the Eritrean diaspora making progress. For example, in Holland, they did good progress, and they managed to get to the bottom of the problems. For example, 2% and other issues as well. So, do you have any view on that?
Yes, I think that people should continue to take the same cause up here. And, you know, the point about people who live in, shall we say, Britain or America or France or wherever in the West, they live in democracies, and they should use the democratic process that exists here. You have MPs or members of the legislature like anybody else, and they're answerable to you. And you need to go and see them, talk to them, persuade them of your views, and say, please, will you intervene on behalf of our community? You have a right to do it. This is a democracy. Go and do it.
Thank you. Regarding the Eritrean community in England, I think we saw yesterday the UK Parliament has allowed them to have petition on the Israel refugee. So what was your view on that?
Well, that's great. That's exactly the sort of thing that I think people should use. It's a democratic process. What you now need to do is to make sure that people who are both Eritreans and non-Eritreans who support you know about it, and go and get people to sign up to it, and try and make it. It's a big ask, but you need 10,000 people to sign it. Then it gets discussed by the British government, and you know, it's a way of getting your views known. I think it's excellent.
In Eritrea, there is no hospital. The education system is one of the worst systems they have. The hospital don't have any medical medicine. There is no, as you mentioned, there is no free newspaper. There is no freedom. There is no hope in Eritrea. Is there any country which went through similar to Eritrea for the last 50 years had made any good progress? Can you give us any advice on this, or how to make Eritrea much better than in the long term?
Yes, I mean, I'll use the country that I know best, which is South Africa, and the struggle against apartheid, which was, of course, not the same as the situation in Eritrea, but it was a terribly repressive government, and, you know, at the time it looked as if it would be there forever. And then one day it wasn't. And how did we get there? And the answer is that they used every possible means. There was struggle inside the country, there was struggle outside of the country. So, for example, there was boycotting of the oranges, which were being produced by South Africa. And they said, we will call on the British people not to buy any more South African oranges. And they had all sorts of tactics. For example, they would go and they'd take all the the oranges off the shelves of the supermarket, put them in trolleys, take them to the till and say, we're not going to buy this.
Interesting.
To make a point.
Yeah.
Now you have some Armani shirts which are produced in Asmara now. Where's the demonstration by Eritreans saying, do not buy Armani shirts?
Okay.
It's one thing you could do. It's entirely up to you whether you want to do it.
Yeah.
But those were the sort of tactics which were the very simple ones which we use outside the country. Inside the country, the struggle was much more important, and it was through the trade union movement, it was through the underground movement. There were lots of different ways in which it happened. Now, I completely accept that Eritrea in some ways is even more oppressive than the apartheid system, because the apartheid system did have independent opposition parties, it did have newspapers which criticized the government, it did have courts which, you could take a case before. So there were things, there was an open parliament. I'm not saying that, of course, they were racist, they were only controlled by the whites, but nonetheless they weren't just a one-party state. Whereas in Eritrea you don't have those possibilities. If you formed an independent trade union, how long would it last in Eritrea?
Well, it wouldn't.
Exactly.
Seconds.
Exactly. While as in South Africa, I helped and I worked on independent trade unions, and they became powerful. But that was because there was the space to do it. But you will have your own way of doing it. I'm not trying to tell Eritreans how they must do things. It's up to Eritreans to find their own way forward. I can't explain that. But that gives you one. And now in South Africa we have an independent country with a good constitution, good laws. We have a terrible president now. I mean, Jacob Zuma is a corrupt, awful president, but the constitution is there, and I'm hopeful that in a few days he'll be gone. So, things can change.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to say South Africa is perfect. It certainly is not.
Yeah.
But, it is much, much, much better than it was under apartheid.
So the basic thing is human right, constitution, education, hospital, transport. This is how we should focus in Eritrea. Plus, as you said, outside of Eritrea, the diaspora group should fight for their freedom.
Exactly. One other thing, I think that Eritreans need to learn to love each other a little bit more.
Okay.
And not be quite so divided.
Okay. Interesting. So, when you say divided, how do you see that? How do we make that happen?
That's up to you.
Yeah.
I cannot tell you how to overcome your problems, but I mean the endless bickering over who did what in the 1960s, 70s, 50s, and God knows when.
Yeah.
That doesn't help you. But you know that already.
Yeah.
And the divisions that the government is able to sow inside your organizations is terribly damaging.
Okay.
That is tough. How you're going to overcome it, I have no idea.
Yeah.
But it can be done.
Sure. So Eritrean, they have to fight for their freedom, and they have to make it more professional or have a strategy before they can get to any plan. I think.
I wouldn't say go for a strategy. Go for doing.
Okay.
It is much better to do than to
action.
strategize. Yes.
Yeah.
I cannot remember how many strategies, constitutions, meetings I've heard about.
Okay.
Do something.
So Eritrean, we have to take action. Behalf of the voiceless Eritrean people to need to take action in the UK, in Europe, and get together to remove the regime in Eritrea and his activity in Europe as well.
I think so, but it's up to Eritreans.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for taking your time to have with us today.
Good.